Welcome to Crisis and Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today we're doing a deep dive into the incredibly complex and often deliberately obscure world of European politics and finance. And our guide for this is a really explosive first-person account from the former Greek finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis. The book is Adults in the Room.
And the fundamental question we're tackling here, it's a systemic one, and it goes so far beyond just the Greek crisis in 2015.
Yeah.
It's really this. Can a democratic mandate, the will of the people, actually survive? Can it function inside these massive supranational financial systems that operate way beyond any kind of traditional public or parliamentary accountability?
Exactly. And this isn't just some theoretical debate for academics. I mean, this matters right now because the most critical decisions about your country's budget, about debt, about welfare, that's all economic governance, right? And it's increasingly being handled by these incredibly powerful technocratic institutions. We're talking about the Eurogroup, the European Central Bank, the ECB, and the IMF. And these bodies, they're often set up, intentionally, to be insulated from the direct scrutiny of voters.
Precisely. So for this whole deep dive, we're going to be focusing very consciously on the institutional design, on the dynamics of system power. We're using the events of 2015 as a kind of, a meticulously documented case study. And we are intentionally moving past the personal politics, past any idea of heroism or partisan blame. This isn't about who is right or wrong. It's about looking at the structure itself, the rules of the game that, basically defined what was even possible.
We're trying to understand how a system, really regardless of the personalities inside it, can neutralize a direct democratic challenge. Varoufakis gives us this incredible window into what happens when an elected government with a clear mandate to end austerity collides head-on with a closed financial bureaucracy that is, above all else, designed for its own continuity.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We need some context first, starting with the author himself. Who is Yanis Varoufakis, and how did he suddenly get thrust into what seems like an impossible role?
Well, that's what's so key. He came to this battle not as a career politician, but as a pretty distinguished economist and professor. He was already known for his critical analysis of the Eurozone's structural flaws, and this was long before the 2008 crash.
So he'd been writing about the very storm he was about to sail into.
Exactly. He was, in effect, thrust into the belly of the beast that he'd spent years analyzing from the outside. He knew the theory, and then suddenly he was living the reality.
That gives him such a unique position, doesn't it? He's not just some bureaucrat reading macroeconomic data. He's a participant observer in the truest sense.
He is. And the book, Adults in the Room, it's a record of his incredibly turbulent 162 days in office as Greece's finance minister. And it's him trying to negotiate the country's debt crisis with Europe's creditors. It's a very unusual political memoir because it reads less like a personal diary and more like a detailed systems audit of how power actually works.
Okay, so let's set the historical stage, because this wasn't happening in a vacuum.
No, not at all. The historical setting is absolutely crucial. This is all taking place against the backdrop of the post-2008 Eurozone crisis. So after the initial bank failures, the main response from the powers that be was defined by one word: austerity.
And this austerity was imposed by the Troika.
Troika, right. That's the shorthand for the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. And they were imposing these policies on the so-called peripheral countries like Greece, Portugal, Ireland, which had been hit hardest by the sovereign debt crisis.
And the public narrative at the time, as I remember it, was one of, profligate, irresponsible southern states being rescued by their generous, responsible northern partners. But Varoufakis just completely blows that narrative up.
He does. And that brings us right to the book's central thesis. And if we put it in plain language, it's this. The European Union's economic governance during the Greek crisis was basically a closed technocratic system. And its primary objective. This is the key. It wasn't economic success for Greece. It wasn't debt sustainability. It was the preservation of the existing financial arrangements and institutional authority. So he argues this system ultimately just suppressed democratic choice, all under the guise of financial necessity.
So it's the difference between, say, treating the patient versus just making sure the hospital's internal rules are followed, even if the patient dies.
That's a great way to put it, precisely. And this systemic failure, as Varoufakis argues, it led to massive collateral damage. He makes the case that the brutal suppression of Greece's democratic mandate didn't just hurt Greece. It sent a clear, and frankly chilling message across all of Europe.
What was the message?
The message was, your vote is irrelevant if it challenges the financial status quo. He actually links this moment directly to the rising tide of, authoritarianism, populist revolt, and the instability we saw in things like Brexit and the rise of Trumpism.
That erosion of public faith seems like the most dangerous long-term outcome. I mean, the institutional establishment launched this incredibly effective campaign of what he calls truth reversal and character assassination against a democratically elected and, mind you, a pro-European government. So if a vote to simply end failed austerity policies is treated like an existential threat to the continent, then, why bother voting at all?
And that gets to this profound internal conflict that Varoufakis himself was dealing with. The conflict between the academic who understood the truth of the situation and the minister who had to somehow operate within this broken system. And it's all framed perfectly by this famous anecdote involving the former U.S. Treasury Secretary, Larry Summers.
Ah, yes, the outsider's dilemma. This really sets the tone for the entire book, doesn't it? Varoufakis tells the story of meeting Summers in Washington before he'd even taken office. And Summers asks him this one crucial question. Are you an insider or an outsider?
And Summers, who knows this system inside and out, he offers this just devastating distinction. He says the outsiders, they prioritize their freedom to speak their version of the truth.
But no one listens.
But they are ignored by the insiders, who are the ones actually making the important decisions.
And the insiders, what's their deal?
The insiders follow what Summers calls a sacrosanct rule. You never, ever turn against other insiders, and you never talk to outsiders about what insiders are saying or doing. The reward for that is access. It's a chance, but not a guarantee, of influencing powerful people.
So the price of admission is silence and compliance, even if you know the policy you're following is doomed to fail.
Exactly. And the entire narrative of the book is structured around Varoufakis trying to be an effective insider, just for long enough to secure a rational, viable debt deal for Greece. But ultimately, he chooses to become an outsider, to tell the truth when the system demanded permanent, non-viable compliance.
He realized the game was rigged, that the institutions weren't built to accommodate rational proposals, they were built to enforce the existing hierarchy.
And the very existence of this book confirms his choice. He became the whistleblower, the outsider who chose truth over access.
That sets the stage beautifully. So let's get into the core systems analysis. Let's look at the actual mechanisms that Varoufakis saw at work in those secret Eurogroup meetings. We can break it down into, say, the institutional design, the incentives that design created, and then the political outcomes.
Sounds good. Let's start with maybe the most abstract but also the most critical concept he uses. He calls it financial opacity as a tool of institutional control, or, his term for it, the super black box.
Okay, a black box, I get. It's like a smartphone, right? The internals are totally opaque, but the outputs are predictable. You push a button, something happens. But what makes the financial system a super black box?
A super black box is a system that is so vast, so complex, so interconnected. Think about global banks, derivative markets, the whole network of interbank lending, and then the supranational bodies that are supposed to govern them. It's so complex that even its own creators and senior controllers can't fully understand its inner workings.
So they can't predict the risks.
They can't. The system generates these outputs that shave millions of lives, like the 2008 crash, but the actual cause and effect inside the box is fundamentally opaque to everyone.
So if nobody truly understands it, how can anyone be said to be in control? And how does this lead to his idea of a conspiracy without conspirators?
It leads there directly. Because the opacity means that the misfortune the system generates, it's not the result of some, cunning men plotting in a smoke-filled room. It's what you'd call an emergent property of the network itself. The institutional design is built on layers of complexity, on exclusion, and on a very tightly controlled flow of information. The rules aren't written down in one place, they're just encoded in how the actors behave.
So the lack of transparency is the feature, not a bug. It's what shields the network from any real external critique or reform.
Exactly. And that's what drives the incentive structure. Since no single person can possibly comprehend the whole system, power comes from having access to small, crucial, privileged pieces of information. So insiders follow that rule from Larry Summers because sharing information internally makes them more relevant.
It's like a currency.
It is. Imagine a senior regulator or a banker discovers some critical flaw that's going to cause a disaster. They face a dilemma. Do they leak it and become a whistleblower and then become totally irrelevant to the system forever? Or do they use that sensitive information to trade with another insider, which cements their position inside the network.
So the incentive is always to maintain the network and its secrecy, not necessarily to pursue successful or rational policy. Policy failure is acceptable. Systemic transparency is not.
And the political outcome of that is just profound. This network, it evolves organically. It's guided by this kind of super intentional self-preservation drive that no single person can control. Not the CEO of a major bank, not the president of the European Commission. It generates these self-reinforcing power structures that resist any external democratic pressure. And that, Varoufakis argues, leads to continental-scale misfortune. Even though the individual actors inside might be perfectly well-intentioned people, it becomes a systemic tragedy.
That's a powerful shift, isn't it? Moving from analyzing personal malice, blaming individuals, to analyzing a systemic tragedy. It suggests the players themselves are trapped by the very architecture they're supposed to be managing.
Absolutely. And now we can move from that abstract idea of the super black box down to the most specific, decisive center of power that Varoufakis dealt with, the Eurogroup. This is where the structural design gets, well, particularly strange.
Right, he makes a huge point of this. The Eurogroup is constantly described as the body making Europe's most vital financial decisions, but it has no legal standing in any EU treaties.
None. It's an informal, ad hoc body, yet it holds life and death power over sovereign nations. And it convenes in secret, with no formal records or minutes being published.
So how does that informality, that institutional design, give it so much power? You'd think the opposite would be true.
Well, the institutional design, it's very informality. That's the key. It shields all its decisions from parliamentary and democratic accountability. It prevents the kind of scrutiny a formal EU body would have to face. Varoufakis describes the meetings as rituals. The elected ministers, the supposed decision-makers, they would receive no substantial pre-briefings. Their documents were often only given to them when they were already in the room.
So they were coming in completely cold.
Coming in cold, while the real power was with the permanent, unelected representatives of the three institutions, the Commission, the IMF, the ECB, and especially the Eurogroup Working Group, or EWG, which prepares the meetings. These technocrats, they presented their views first. They set the tone and the terms of the debate before the elected officials even got a chance to speak.
So that structure formalizes the authority of the unelected technocrats over the elected ministers. It's a complete inversion of democratic accountability.
It is. The incentive structure for the technocrats, people like Thomas Weiser, who chaired the EWG, was to maintain this procedural control. The structure ensures that the minister's role is basically just to approve and legitimize decisions that have already been taken behind the scenes. The ministers are there to provide a political veneer.
And the political outcome is this slow-motion erosion of national sovereignty without any need for a formal treaty change. The system forces elected ministers to just rubber stamp policies dictated by unelected officials. It creates this huge sense of distance and confusion between where decisions are made and where democratic input is supposed to happen.
And this systemic design, it was already well in place when Varoufakis arrived, but he traces its origins back to the very first bailout. And this brings us to the strategy that sustained the previous 5 years of the crisis. Extend and pretend as a systemic strategy, not a policy failure.
This is a really harsh but central point of the book. Varoufakis insists that the 2010 rescue loan for Greece wasn't about saving Greece at all. He calls it the world's greatest bankruptcy cover-up.
And the evidence he points to is pretty staggering. By early 2010, the Greek state was completely, utterly bankrupt. The initial loans, they weren't transferred to the Greek treasury to fund hospitals or pensions. They went directly to recapitalize French and German banks.
Why?
Because those banks were facing catastrophic losses from their massive exposure, he estimates it at around 1 trillion euros collectively, to the debt of peripheral countries.
So the money went straight to Paris and Berlin, not Athens.
The vast majority of it, yes.
Yeah.
The institutional design of that first bailout was driven by the political survival of leaders like Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy. They knew they could not go to their own parliaments and publicly ask for hundreds of billions of taxpayer euros to cover the failures of their own bankers who'd been making these complex, toxic bets.
So they needed a different story, a narrative that could recast a bailout of bankers as an act of solidarity for a profligate nation.
Precisely. That was the incentive structure. Political necessity masking financial reality. The mechanism allowed for what he calls a cynical transfer of losses from the books of the Franco-German banks to the shoulders of Europe's weakest taxpayers, all under the noble guise of saving the euro. Greece just became the designated debtor, used to conceal the creditor's own vulnerability.
And the cost of that cover-up for Greece was just immense.
Greece was effectively imprisoned at what he calls Beiloudistan.
Yeah.
The loans were conditional on these policies of swinging austerity. I mean, a projected 15% reduction in government spending within 2 years. That Varoufakis says even the creditors themselves, and he notably points to the IMF's managing director, Christine Lagarde, admitted privately couldn't work.
Wait, hold on. If the policies were known to be non-viable, why on earth were they imposed?
Because the goal was not viability. The goal was process continuity and maintaining the illusion of solvency. That was the political outcome. The system required this official denial, this truth reversal, to maintain the fiction that Greece could eventually repay this massive new debt that was being piled on. And this led to a depression that caused Greece's national income to plunge by a catastrophic 28%. The cure was structurally designed to be worse than the disease.
That sets the stage for the specific negotiations Varoufakis walked into in 2015. If the whole system was designed to conceal failure, it was certainly not designed to accommodate rational proposals for success. So let's look at the process of the negotiations designed to manage compliance, not reach agreement.
Right. The negotiations were characterized by these structural hurdles that seemed designed specifically to exhaust, humiliate, and ultimately corner the new Greek government. They weren't being treated as negotiating partners. They were being treated as a compliance problem to be managed.
What were some of the key tactics that were deployed against him?
He highlights two main ones. The first he calls the Eurozone runaround. So when Varoufakis would try to discuss debt restructuring with, say, the powerful German finance minister Wolfgang Schäuble, Schäuble would just insist he had to go to the institutions, meaning the Troika.
Okay.
But then the Troika's middle managers, they lacked any political mandate to actually negotiate debt relief. So they would just reject his serious academically vetted proposals, any neutral economist would have supported, saying it was above their pay grade.
So it's this brilliant but cruel institutional design. He's being shuttled between powerful figures who claim they lack the authority and less powerful figures who can only say no. It's a systemic way of making sure the clock just keeps ticking down towards crisis.
It is. And the second tactic he calls the Penelope ruse. This refers to Odysseus' wife, Penelope, in the epic poem. She delayed her unwanted suitors by promising to choose one of them only after she finished weaving a shroud, which she would then secretly unravel every single night.
A perfect metaphor for the delaying tactics the creditors used, because delay is the weapon of the side that knows the ticking clock is their ally.
Exactly. The Troika would receive Varoufakis' proposals, for example, a very common and rational idea, to link debt repayment to Greek GDP growth. And they would give them what he calls the Swedish national anthem treatment.
Which means?
Just blank stares, silence, and then immediately moving to the next agenda item as if the Greek presentation had never even happened. They used deliberate foot dragging on paperwork, on mandates, on meeting schedules. They were literally weaving and unweaving the shroud of negotiations every night to run out the clock.
The incentive structure for the creditors seems so clear then. It was about maintaining institutional authority and, critically, avoiding setting a precedent. If Greece got a viable deal, what message does that send to Italy or Spain or Portugal?
Right. Economic logic or proposals for mutual benefit, they were completely irrelevant compared to preserving the hierarchy.
So the political outcome was always going to be an ultimatum. The default stance was you either agree to the existing non-viable program. The program is the program, as he quotes them, which echoes Henry Ford's famous line that you can have the Model T in any color as long as it's black, or you face a complete crash out of the Eurozone.
And that brings us to the moment where the technocratic system moved beyond just delay and directly activated its financial siege weapon. This is the use of crisis to override democratic outcomes.
Right. When the Syriza government was elected with that incredibly clear mandate to end austerity, the Eurogroup and the ECB, they didn't hesitate, did they? They activated measures almost immediately to trigger a liquidity crisis, using the financial system itself as a political bludgeon.
They did. And the specific mechanism the ECB used, this is where the technical details become political dynamite.
Explain it for us.
The mechanism was the withdrawal of the junk collateral waiver for Greek banks. This was related to something called Emergency Liquidity Assistance, or ELA. ELA is basically the lifeline that banks use when they can't get money from traditional markets. It's administered by the National Central Bank, but it's ultimately controlled by the ECB's governing council.
And normally, for a bank to get this assistance, it has to put up some kind of collateral, some valuable asset.
Correct. But after the crisis, Greek state bonds had been downgraded to junk status. So to keep Greek banks from collapsing, the ECB had issued a waiver, which allowed those junk bonds to still be used as collateral to get these ELA funds.
Okay.
On February 4th, 2015, almost immediately after the series of victory, the ECB withdrew that waiver.
A technical decision, but the timing feels anything but.
It was the financial equivalent of pulling the plug on the life support machine. By withdrawing the waiver, the ECB instantly forced the Greek central bank to provide billions in ELA funding at much higher punitive interest rates. And at the same time, it created profound fear among depositors. This one single technical action caused a massive, accelerating bank run. It effectively made Greece's plunge toward insolvency a near certainty.
The incentive structure behind this action, as Varoufakis captures it, was basically spelled out by Wolfgang Schäuble, who he quotes as saying that elections cannot be allowed to change economic policy. The continuity of the Eurozone system was prioritized over the result of a democratic vote in a member state.
The crisis mechanism wasn't an accident, it was a calibrated threat. Varoufakis calls it gunboat diplomacy, but financial. The threat was crystal clear. Submit to our program, or your banks will be shut down, your cash machines will stop dispensing money, and your economy will completely collapse.
And that threat among the creditors had a name. It was known as Plan Z.
Plan Z. The system used its ultimate power, its control over liquidity, to extract compliance. This threat forced the Greek government into a horrible Sophie's choice trade-off. It made the Greek people choose between their own democratic mandate and total financial stability. It's the most potent form of coercion because it directly threatens the immediate survival of the population.
And the final insult, as you mentioned before,
It's crucial. You have to understand that everyone involved, even the most powerful people, they are all operating within these structural constraints dictated by the institutional design. Their personal intentions often conflicted with the roles they were mandated to play.
Okay, so let's start with the big ones. The national governments, primarily France and Germany, and the constraint of their own domestic politics.
Their incentive was, overwhelmingly driven by the immediate need to conceal the losses coming from their banks. That nearly €1 trillion stake we talked about, and crucially, to maintain political capital at home. Merkel, for instance, she operated under the very hard constraint of the German parliament, the Bundestag.
She couldn't go back and admit they were bailing out bankers again.
She couldn't. After years of lecturing everyone else on financial prudence, she could not go back to her parliament and confess that the previous bailouts hadn't worked, and that now she needed hundreds of billions more just to cover bank liabilities. So their hardline stance, it was primarily a defensive political move to protect their own domestic viability and maintain this narrative of responsibility.
Okay, next. The true center of operational power, as he describes it. The Eurogroup Working Group, EWG, chaired by a man named Thomas Weiser, who Varoufakis calls the most powerful man in Brussels.
The EWG is that technical, informal center. Weiser is presented as the real power broker because he controlled the flow of information, the document, the agenda, and this is critical, the summary of the meetings that the finance ministers were then forced to approve. He wasn't elected by anyone, yet he was dictating the procedural reality of the entire Eurozone.
So what was his incentive?
His incentive was to maintain compliance and manage that runaround. His personal power came from keeping the system opaque and making sure it functioned smoothly according to its predetermined anti-democratic rules. He wasn't incentivized to solve the Greek crisis economically. He was incentivized to manage the Greek government politically.
All right, moving to the European Central Bank, ECB, led by Mario Draghi and Benoit Cœuré, officially apolitical, but holding the most devastating political lever of all.
The ECB held two critical tools. First, that ELA liquidity news we just discussed.
Yeah.
But second, they held what he calls the Achilles heel, the Securities Markets Program, or SMP, bonds. These were Greece bonds that the ECB had bought from banks at a previous crisis.
And why were those specific bonds so politically explosive?
Because of legal risk, primarily from Germany. If Draghi allowed any kind of haircut or even a delay in the repayment of those specific Greek SMP bonds, he would open the ECB to major legal challenges, particularly from the German Constitutional Court, which was already deeply suspicious that the ECB was overstepping its mandate.
So if the German court successfully challenged the ECB on these Greek bonds, it could threaten Draghi's entire, vastly larger quantitative easing program, the QE program, which was seen as necessary to stabilize the whole Eurozone.
That is the ultimate constraint. Draghi's incentive was to preserve the credibility and legality of the ECB's overall bond buying program. He had to be completely rigid on those few billion of Greek debt because not doing so risked the collapse of the QE program, which back in 2015 was seen as the only thing holding the entire euro together. So his actions, they weren't really about Greece. They were about defending the institutional integrity of the ECB against the German legal system.
And what about the IMF, with Christine Lagarde and Paul Thompson? They seem to be the most internally conflicted actors in the whole story.
They really were. They were sort of dragged into Beilutistan initially by European pressure, but their own experts knew the debt was unsustainable. Varoufakis confirms that the IMF ran the numbers and completely agreed that Greece needed significant debt relief to survive. The IMF's own internal economic analysis was actually aligned with the Greek position.
So why did they continue to enforce policies they knew were destined to fail?
Institutional continuity and partnership pressure. The incentive for Lagarde and Thompson was to prioritize the IMF's institutional relationship with its most powerful members, the European states, over its own economic viability studies. They were just stuck. They knew the program was doomed, but they were bound by the need to maintain the facade of the Troika's unity.
And finally, the national finance ministers like Schäuble. We mentioned his domestic constraints, but what about his personal approach? He seems like a key figure.
Varoufakis depicts Schäuble as this highly intelligent, if incredibly rigid individual who saw the whole negotiation as fundamentally political and existential, not economic. Schäuble was actually clear in private that he thought Greece needed to leave the Eurozone to have a chance of recovery, but he couldn't say that publicly because of the immediate instability it would cause.
And his primary constraint was not having to go back to the Bundestag and confess that previous plans had failed.
Yes. For Schäuble, democracy was really just a complication in the management of this vast supranational financial architecture. He felt the system demanded rigidity above all else in order to survive.
So when you map all these actors and their constraints, the system's overall incentives really just coalesce into a few key things. Preserve the Eurozone structure at all costs, avoid legal challenges, maintain creditor confidence, and ensure institutional continuity.
And these incentives were then upheld by a very controlled set of narratives that were deployed through the media and public statements. The establishment cast Varoufakis as irresponsible, a gambler, an amateur for refusing to sign on to a non-viable deal. This was the narrative of responsibility and realism.
And the mantra that was repeated constantly, there is no alternative, the program is the program.
And then the final dig, the one that gives the book its title, Lagarde's famous moment of exasperation where she said they needed adults in the room, the implication being that the democratically elected Syriza government were behaving like children who needed to be supervised by mature, sensible technocrats.
Let's turn to what might be the most fascinating piece of the analysis. How does a system like this persist, even when it's generating visible failure? We need to look at the feedback loops that perpetuated the crisis.
The primary negative feedback loop was self-reinforcing. It was a spiral of debt and austerity. So the initial austerity policies, those massive spending reductions, they caused Greece's national income to plunge by that 28%. Now, when your national income falls that dramatically, your debt-to-GDP ratio instantly spikes, even if the debt stays the same.
And a higher debt-to-GDP ratio requires even more drastic measures from the creditors.
Exactly. That increased ratio, in turn, required the creditors to impose more austerity and more control, which then required new loans, more memoranda of understanding, and the further loss of Greek sovereignty over its key assets in its banks. Austerity deepened the crisis, which then justified further control, which then led to more austerity.
It's an inherently tragic loop. So why did these systems persist even when their failures were so publicly visible and, as you said, widely known even by insiders like Lagarde?
Because the actors feared the predicted doom, the immediate chaotic collapse of the euro, far more than they feared the slow systemic damage caused by the failing policies. They chose immediate structural preservation over any kind of long-term economic viability.
And this is where Varoufakis brings in that classical tragedy analogy, right? He invokes Macbeth and Oedipus.
It's a brilliant analogy. Just as King Laius unwittingly caused his own murder by trying to fearfully avoid the prophecy that foretold it, the smartest and most powerful players in this story, Draghi, Schäuble, Lagarde, they brought about their own long-term political doom because they were so terrified of the immediate financial prophecy of a euro collapse.
So by fearing that Greece's default might cause them to lose political control over Europe, they imposed these increasingly rigid and irrational policies that gradually undermine their own political legitimacy, not just in Greece, but across the entire continent. They were trapped in a loop, just adding error on top of error, unable to retreat.
The short-term continuity of the system was preserved, yes, but only at the immense expense of its long-term democratic legitimacy and public faith. And that systemic failure, he argues, paved the way for the political turbulence we see today.
Which makes the present-day implications unavoidable. I mean, the book really serves as a vital structural blueprint for understanding ongoing issues in governance far beyond the Mediterranean.
The key is the precedent that was set in 2015. The fact that the Eurogroup is an informal body, that it's not legally bound, and that the continuity of the system was prioritized over the outcome of a democratic election, that remains a structural feature of Eurozone governance today.
And that structural feature continues to undermine the legitimacy of the entire monetary union. Because citizens know, at a fundamental level, that certain economic decisions are simply non-negotiable, regardless of who they vote for.
This really highlights the ongoing democratic erosion under financial emergency rule. The system exposed the ability of these unelected bodies, the Eurogroup Secretariat, the ECB, to assert immense power without any legal backing. They basically established a template where financial necessity can be used to suspend or overrule democratic choice.
We saw it with that forced request for the third bailout, but this template, it could be applied anywhere. If a financial crisis can be manufactured to enforce a political outcome, what protection do citizens really have?
And this feeds directly into the normalization of technocratic authority. The transfer of national sovereignty over key areas, banking supervision, privatization funds, fiscal policy, to these technocratic oversight groups like the Hellenic Financial Stability Facility. It's normalized the idea that financial decisions are just too complex and too critical to be handled by messy parliaments. They're better managed by insiders who just tick procedural boxes.
It sounds like a quiet, gradual surrender of democracy in exchange for a perception of stability.
It is a systemic surrender. And it has led, almost inevitably, to widespread public distrust in political institutions. That campaign of truth reversal and character assassination against the Syriza government, which was, let's remember, democratically elected on a very clear mandate, that directly contributed to a broader populist revolt.
Because citizens watched as their vote was nullified in real time, they realized their choices were being dictated by this powerful transnational financial system that operates way above their heads. And that leads to the sense that the establishment is rigged, regardless of which party is in power.
Varoufakis argues that the establishment's attack on what was a moderate pro-European left-wing government actually pushed voters toward more extreme anti-system parties because they felt that only a true outsider could possibly challenge such entrenched power structures.
This connects so perfectly to the mission of this project, of crisis in perception, moving beyond blaming individuals to understanding system dynamics. The book gives us that rare perspective we need to make that leap.
It's valuable precisely because it moves past the simple story of goodies and baddies. I mean, Varoufakis is very clear that these sophisticated, powerful individuals, Lagarde, Draghi, Schäuble, they were themselves caught in an institutional trap of their own making. Their actions were often constrained by the rules and requirements of their specific institutional role, even if those actions led to these tragic outcomes.
So the focus shifts completely. It moves from the personal competence or malice of a few people to the tragic, super-intentional dynamics of the super black box network. No single person intended for Greece to collapse, but the system's design made it the inevitable outcome.
And we see so clearly how power hides behind procedure. The Eurozone runaround, the insistence on legalistic jargon, the reliance on technical interpretations of the ECB's charter, the obsession with process, all of it functioned as camouflage. This procedure obscured the raw exercise of political power and moral judgment that was actually taking place.
The ECB's refusal to lift that ELA liquidity restriction was always presented as a purely technical, apolitical necessity based on its charter. But Varoufakis constantly argued, and the system's actions proved, that cutting off liquidity during sensitive political negotiations was the ultimate political act.
It was coercion disguised as bureaucracy. Which brings us to the final theme we should touch on: why democratic outcomes are overridden without visible coercion.
Because the coercion wasn't military or political in the traditional sense, was it? There were no tanks in the streets of Athens. Instead, the system used its control over liquidity and the flow of money Plan Z, that threat to shut down the entire banking system, to extract compliance.
The system systematically turned the Greek people's dignity, their sovereignty, and their democratic consent into the ultimate bargaining chips. They weren't coerced by military force, but by the immediate existential threat of destitution. of being permanently locked out of the global financial system. The threat to people's savings and basic economic function was the modern form of warfare against sovereignty.
It provides such a powerful new lens to view the relationship between democracy and finance, not just in Europe, but globally. So, in conclusion, what does adults in the room ultimately help us see differently?
I think it fundamentally helps us reevaluate the true nature of democracy when it's under severe economic constraint. It illustrates that power thrives without accountability in these informal technocratic bodies like the Eurogroup, and it shows that transparency and economic logic are often completely irrelevant when institutional continuity is the single non-negotiable goal.
And the final tragic irony, as Varoufakis notes, is that by forcing Greece to submit to a non-viable agreement in 2015 just to save the system in the short term, the establishment actually sowed the seeds of the system's ongoing crisis of legitimacy. They fueled the rise of destructive anti-establishment forces across Europe and the Western world. They created the very political breakdown they feared by being too afraid of the short-term financial reckoning.
The system demanded that Varoufakis and his colleagues compromise their democratic mandate to become insiders, to prioritize access over truth and compliance over viability. But Varoufakis' final provocative thought for us, as citizens, is whether we can really afford to remain outsiders to a financial architecture that fundamentally determines our political and economic choices, and which by its very design subordinates our democratic will.
A heavy, but an absolutely essential question for every citizen of a modern state.
That was our deep dive into Adults in the Room.
Credit the author, Yanis Varoufakis, for Adults in the Room. We highly encourage reading the book or borrowing it from a library.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.